It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you.
She was curled behind my hay bales, bleeding something that wasn't red. And the moment I stepped through the barn door, she pressed herself so hard against the wall, I thought she'd go straight through it. She wasn't afraid of the dark. She was afraid of me. Before this is over, you're going to understand 3 things. 1, what it actually feels like to be the scary thing in the room, when someone who isn't human looks at you and sees a monster. 2, what happens when the people hunting her show up at your door and you have to decide in about 4 seconds whether you're the kind of person who steps aside or the kind who steps up. And 3, what she left behind when she was finally well enough to leave. And I promise you that last part, that's the one that keeps me up at night. My name's Marcus Hale. I run 42 acres of cattle and grain outside of Harlan, Nebraska. Population 811. Nothing ever happens here. Until the night it did. It was the 3rd week of October, and the temperature had already dropped to that particular cruelty that Nebraska does. Not cold enough to be dramatic, just cold enough that going outside at 2 in the morning feels genuinely stupid. My cattle were restless. That was what woke me. I've had those animals long enough to know the difference between they're just bored restless and something is wrong restless. This was the second kind. The kind where they bunch together near the far fence and go quiet in a way that's somehow louder than mooing. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my flashlight, didn't grab my rifle, which I'll come back to because that decision mattered, and walked the 200 feet from my back door to the barn. The big sliding door was cracked open about 3 inches. I hadn't left it that way. Now, I want to be clear about something. I am not a brave man. I'm a practical man. There's a difference. A brave man sees a cracked barn door at 2 a.m. and charges in. A practical man stands outside it for a solid 30 seconds, asking himself whether this is a raccoon situation or a person situation, because those require different responses. The answer, as it turned out, was neither. I pushed the door open slow and swept the flashlight left to right the way my grandfather taught me. A man who had apparently encountered enough unexpected barn situations in his life to develop a methodology. The first pass, nothing. Hay bales, tractor, the feed wall, nothing. The second pass, one of my horses, Cassidy, was standing in the far corner with her ears flat and her eyes showing white. She does that when she's scared. Cassidy is not easily scared. I swept the light lower, toward the floor, toward the hay bales. And that's when I saw the hand. Not a human hand. I want to be precise here because I've heard versions of this story where people say things like, "At first I thought it was human." And I don't want to do that to you. I did not think it was human. The proportions were wrong. The fingers were too long. Not grotesquely, not in a horror movie way, but in the way that you look at a greyhound next to a Labrador and something in your brain quietly registers. Same basic blueprint, different design spec. The skin was a gray-blue, not corpse gray, more like the inside of a mussel shell. There were 3 fingers and a thumb, and they were wrapped around the base of the hay bale in a grip that said, "I am trying very hard not to make a sound." I froze. Completely. Absolutely. Every system in my body went into a mode I'd call loading screen, like my brain was processing something it didn't have a file format for. And then the hand moved, and a face appeared from behind the hay bale, and whatever I had been expecting, and honestly I hadn't gotten that far, it wasn't this. She was looking at me the way a deer looks at headlights. But a deer doesn't have that kind of intelligence in its eyes. A deer isn't doing math. She was doing math. I want you to sit with that for a second. Because the thing that hit me hardest in that moment wasn't, "There's an alien in my barn." It was that she was scared. Genuinely, visibly, desperately scared. And she was scared of me. Keep that in mind. We're going to come back to it. I'll describe her the way I describe anything. Straight, in order, without editorializing. Because I think she deserves that. She was tall. Even curled in on herself like that, tucked behind the hay. I could tell she had height on me, and I'm 6'1". Slender frame, but not fragile. The kind of build you see on climbers. Long limbs, a narrower torso than you'd expect. She was wearing something that looked almost like a flight suit. Close-fitting, dark material that seemed to absorb the light more than it reflected it. There were markings on the collar and left sleeve that I couldn't read and couldn't even tell if they were text or design. Her face was humanoid. I keep using that word because it's accurate and because I'm not sure how else to say it without underselling how genuinely startling it was to look at something that was so close to familiar. 2 eyes set slightly wider than human standard. A nose smaller and flatter. A mouth that was a little wider than you'd expect and was currently pressed into a flat, controlled line. The eyes were what got me. The iris took up almost the entire visible eye. Dark gold, the color of a harvest moon, with thin vertical pupils like a cat. But elongated, stretched almost to the full height of the iris. She was not moving. She was barely breathing. Every muscle in her body was screaming, "Please don't come closer." And that's when my flashlight caught the stain on her side. It was dark, almost black in the low light, but it was spreading slowly down the left side of her suit, seeping out from somewhere under her arm. Her left hand was pressed hard against her ribs. She wasn't hiding it. She'd just decided, apparently, that the wound wasn't the most urgent problem in the room. I was. I stepped back, one full step back, out of the doorway, into the cold air. Not because I was scared. Well, not only because I was scared, but because something in the way she was looking at me made me think that my proximity was making everything worse. I held up my hands. Both of them, palms out. The oldest, dumbest, most universal signal I could think of. I have no weapons. I am not attacking. Please don't do whatever the alien equivalent of a threat display is. She watched me for what felt like a long time. Then, very slowly, the grip on the hay bale loosened. I took that as a limited form of progress. Here's what I didn't know yet. She had been in my barn for almost 6 hours. She'd been bleeding the entire time, and she had chosen, deliberately, not to call for help from her own people. That fact alone should tell you something about what she was running from. I went back inside, and I stood at my kitchen counter for about 5 minutes. I want to be honest about those 5 minutes, because I think they're the most important ones in this whole story. I could have called someone. I almost did. My phone was right there. 3 numbers worth calling came to mind in order. 911, which would have turned my farm into a federal incident by breakfast. My neighbor Dale, who is a good man, but would have arrived with questions I wasn't ready to answer and a shotgun I wasn't ready to manage. And my brother in Omaha, who would have thought I was having some kind of episode. I didn't call any of them. What I did instead was open my refrigerator and stand in front of it trying to figure out, what do you bring an alien who is bleeding in your barn? Which is not a question any survivalist manual has ever prepared me for. I grabbed a bottle of water, because water seems like the kind of thing that crosses a lot of biological boundaries. I grabbed a clean dish towel. I grabbed the first aid kit from under the sink. I knew it wouldn't be right for whatever she was dealing with, but it was what I had. And then I stood there and asked myself a very simple question. What would make me feel safer right now if I were her? And the answer was, knowing what you're going to do before you do it. So I started talking, out loud, to nobody, to the farm, to myself. I narrated every single thing I was going to do before I did it. I'm going to walk back to the barn now. I'm going to push the door open slow. I'm not going to shine the flashlight in your eyes. I'm going to put this stuff down on the ground and back away from it. I said all of that before I left the house, out loud, to the empty kitchen, and I did exactly that. When I got to the barn, she was in the same position, but her head was turned toward the door. She'd heard me coming. Her eyes tracked me as I pushed the door open slowly, as I moved to the side so the barn light behind me wasn't turning me into a silhouette. As I put the water and the towels and the kit on the ground, maybe 8 feet from where she was. I stepped back 6 steps, sat down on an overturned bucket, and I stopped moving. She watched me for a long time. Then she reached out, pulled the water bottle toward her. She had to stretch. And I saw her wince when she extended that left arm, a sharp micro-expression that she controlled almost immediately. But it told me everything I needed to know about how bad the wound was. And she looked at the bottle. She turned it over in those long fingers, examined the cap, figured out the cap, opened it, smelled it, took a very small sip. And then she looked back at me, and something in her face shifted. I don't have the vocabulary for what the shift was. It wasn't a smile. It wasn't relief. It was closer to a kind of recalculation, like she'd updated something in her model of the situation. I said very quietly, "My name's Marcus. This is my farm. I don't know what happened to you, but I can see you're hurt, and I'm not going to do anything that makes it worse." She didn't respond. Of course she didn't. But she didn't look away. We sat like that for about 20 minutes. Me on the bucket, her behind the hay bale, bleeding, watching me with those gold eyes. Cassidy eventually walked over to me and pressed her nose against my shoulder, which I think was either solidarity or an opinion about my choices. Sometime around 4 in the morning, she let me help. I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone outside this story. When she finally let me close enough to look at the wound, I realized I was the 8th most prepared person on the planet for this moment. And somehow, I was the only one there. She stayed for 3 days. The wound was bad. I won't pretend I knew what I was treating. I packed it with sterile gauze because that's what I had. And to her credit, the biology was close enough to compatible that keeping it clean seemed to help. She ran what I can only describe as a fever on the 2nd day. Her skin temperature spiked and her movements became slow and deliberate in a way that told me her body was doing something intensive internally. She slept in intervals, light and watchful, always with her back to the wall and her eyes toward the door. On the 1st day, we had no communication. Gestures mostly. I brought food. She rejected the meat, accepted cooked grain and vegetables with a sort of restrained curiosity that made me think she was either being polite or was genuinely uncertain whether it was safe. Probably both. On the 2nd day, something remarkable happened. I was sitting in the barn, reading. I'd started bringing a book because the sitting in silence was getting to me, and I didn't want to keep talking at her like a man who had lost his mind. And she made a sound, not a voice, not a word. A sound, 2 tones, close together, that rose at the end. A question. I was almost certain it was a question. I looked up. She was looking at the book. I held it up. "Book," I said. She made the 2-tone sound again. I said, "Book" again. pointed at it, pointed at her. And here's where I genuinely do not know if I'm describing something that happened or something I imagined, because it all moved very fast. She touched two of her long fingers to her temple. Just lightly, a gesture I'd seen her make twice before when she seemed to be concentrating, and made a sound that was not quite "ba" and not quite "book," but was somewhere in the exact phonetic territory between them. We spent the next 4 hours doing that. By the end of day 2, she had about 30 words. Not spoken words, approximations, like someone learning a language through a wall, getting the shape of the sound without all the texture. But I understood her, and she understood me, and that felt like the most important thing that had ever happened on this farm. I learned 3 things about her over those 3 days. The first, her name, as best I could reproduce it, was something like sail. 2 syllables, the second one higher, a small glottal stop in the middle that I could not make correctly to save my life, but that she bore with what I can only describe as patient amusement. The second, she had not crashed. She had jumped. There was a difference, and it was important to her that I understand it. She'd had a way off whatever vessel she'd been on, and she'd used it, and she'd ended up in my barn. She'd chosen this, in other words, under pressure with few options. She had picked a patch of dark agricultural land in the middle of Nebraska as the place she wanted to land. I asked her why. She made a gesture, flat hand, passed once over the horizon. Quiet, empty, away from others. She hadn't wanted to land where anyone would find her. Anyone. The third thing I learned, whoever she was running from wasn't her enemy. They were her crew. And that, I can tell you, is when my stomach dropped. Because here's the thing about running from your own crew. It doesn't mean they're the bad guys. But it means something happened on that ship that made her decide she'd rather bleed alone in a barn on a planet they weren't supposed to be near than go back. And they were coming. She was sure of that. She just didn't know when. As it turned out, the next morning, day 4, I woke up to Cassidy again, that same quality of wrong silence. I looked out my bedroom window, and the sky above the east field was doing something it had no business doing. The stars in a rough oval, maybe 60 degrees of arc, were gone. Not obscured, gone. Like something very large was sitting between me and them, close enough to block them, far enough that I couldn't see any detail. Sael was awake when I got to the barn. She was standing, first time I'd seen her fully upright, and I'll tell you, that did things to my understanding of her scale. And she was looking up at the roof as if she could see through it. She looked at me and said, very clearly, the word she'd made me teach her on day 1, the one she'd seemed most intent on learning. Choice. Then she touched her chest. Then she touched the air between us. Then she made a gesture I'd come to understand as question. She was asking me if I understood that this was my choice. Whatever was about to happen. She was asking if I understood that I could step back. Open the barn door. Point the way. Let them have her. She was giving me an out. I want to be very clear. I thought about it. Not because I wanted to hand her over, but because I'm a practical man. And the practical part of my brain was doing a very fast calculation about the odds of a 42-year-old cattle farmer from Nebraska successfully negotiating with a spacecraft. The odds were not good. But here's what I knew, and what I think mattered. She'd been on that ship. She'd left. She'd landed bleeding in the dark on a random patch of this planet rather than go back. Whatever was on that ship, she'd decided it was worse than bleeding alone in the dark. I had no idea if her call was right, But I knew that she made a choice, and "let me help you stand by it" are two different things, and I knew which one I was willing to be. I pulled the barn door fully open, pulled my truck around to face it, loaded her into the passenger seat. She folded herself into it in a way that told me she'd at least seen the concept of a vehicle, and drove west, toward my back fields, toward the tree line, toward the creek drainage that runs down into the old Hessler property 2 miles out. Behind me, above my barn, the oval of missing stars got lower. We made the tree line with maybe 3 minutes to spare. I cut the engine, cut the lights. We sat in the cab and watched through the windshield as something I cannot fully describe settled into my east field. I can tell you it was not loud. That surprised me. I'd expected noise. A ship is a ship, I figured. There'd be engines or pressure waves or something. There was almost nothing. A low vibration, more felt than heard. Some disturbed dust. And then, in the field, under a sky that had gone quiet and purple in that pre-dawn way, there were lights. Moving lights. 4 of them. Spaced in a wide line, moving toward the barn. Sayal was watching with an expression I couldn't read. She hadn't spoken since we left the barn. After a moment, I said, "Do you want to go back?" Very long pause. "No," she said. That was the clearest word she'd ever spoken in English. I nodded, said nothing. We watched the lights reach the barn, go inside, come back out, spread out, search the perimeter. Methodical, practiced. These were people who knew how to look for someone. It took 40 minutes. Then the lights went back to the field. Then the stars in the east came back. Whatever they were, they left. And she made a sound I'd never heard her make before. Not a word, not a question, not one of our 30 vocabulary items. Just a sound. Low, quiet, from somewhere in her chest. I didn't know what it meant. But I knew grief when I heard it. Here's what I've thought about a lot since then. She let them come. She could have run further. She had 3 days. She stayed close enough to watch. She wasn't hiding from them because she hated them. She was hiding because she'd made a decision they disagreed with, and she wasn't ready to explain it yet. Those are 2 completely different things, and understanding that changed how I thought about the whole story. She stayed for 4 more days after that. She was healing fast, faster than any human wound I've ever seen close up, which was both reassuring and slightly unsettling. And by day 6, she was moving almost normally. Our vocabulary grew, not to full sentences, nowhere close, but enough to have the shape of conversations, enough to understand intentions, if not all the details. I asked her once, as directly as I knew how with the words we had, "Why here?" She thought about it for a while. Then she said, "Far. Quiet. You?" She tapped her palm twice, a gesture she used when she meant something like real or genuine. Did not take. Did not take. Meaning I hadn't tried to take her. Hadn't taken the situation and used it for myself. Hadn't called someone, turned her in, made her into a story I owned. I think about that a lot. On the morning of day 7, I woke up and she was gone. I knew she would be. She'd been saying goodbye in the particular way people do when they're not sure they know the word for goodbye. All the small extra attentions, the last looks at things. The barn was empty. Cassidy was calm. The hay bale she'd been hiding behind when I found her had been moved, very precisely, back to its original position. On my kitchen table, she'd been in my house in the end, and that felt significant. There was something left, small, metal or metal-like, about the size of a $50 coin, flat on one side, slightly convex on the other, with markings on it that I recognized, same markings as her collar, same as her sleeve. I've never been able to read them, and I've never shown them to anyone. It was warm when I picked it up. Not warm from the table warm. Warm like something that had recently been held. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's a thank you or a marker or a record or a message. I don't know if she left it so she could find me again or so something else could. I carry it anyway, in my left front pocket, every day. Because here's what I come back to. That first night in the barn, she was afraid of me. Not of her situation, not of the wound, not of the cold. Of me. Of a human being standing in a doorway with a flashlight. The look she gave me said, I have been here before. I know how this kind of creature responds when it finds something unexpected and vulnerable. I know what they do with it. And she was wrong about me. She updated her model. And I don't know if that means anything in the grand scale of things. I don't know if she went back to her ship eventually and told them. Or if she never speaks of this planet again. Or if there's some record somewhere that marks Harlan, Nebraska as a place where something turned out differently than expected. But I know what it did to me. It made me think very carefully about all the things I dismiss without investigation. All the closed doors I don't open. All the presumed dangerous things I never step back from and ask. What does it look like from inside that situation? What are you afraid of right now, and is that fear about me? That's the story. 42 acres in Nebraska. One night with a cracked barn door. One decision not to grab the rifle. One overturned bucket and 30 vocabulary words, and a coin I carry in my pocket every day. I don't have a lesson for you, because I'm not that kind of person, and I think you're not that kind of audience. But I'll tell you this. The next time something frightened lands in front of you, and it flinches when you move, the question isn't, what is it? The question is, what does it think you are? And what do you want the answer to be? If you're the kind of person who stayed to the end of that story, I think you'll like what comes next on this channel. There's a story I've been sitting on about a soldier who was listed as killed in action on a world no human was supposed to be near. And the message that came back 18 months later. Hit subscribe. We're just getting started.